Every single day, someone comes to me with numbers that look like success. Weight down, clothes looser, the plan working exactly as described. And when I run the actual assessment, grip strength, chair stand, calf circumference, fatigue timeline, I find a body that has been losing the wrong thing. Not fat, muscle. The two processes happened simultaneously, in the same body, without a single external signal to separate them. The scale recorded a total. It did not record a composition. Subscribe now. What I am about to explain, nobody flagged at the appointment where they praised your progress. This condition has a clinical name, sarcopenic obesity. That means the concurrent loss of muscle tissue and the retention or accumulation of fat, particularly visceral fat, the metabolically active fat stored around the internal organs, even in people whose total body weight is falling or holding stable. The number on the scale does not tell you which tissue is leaving. It tells you only that mass is decreasing. What type of mass, from which compartment, in what proportion, the scale is silent on all of it. After 60, 3 biological processes converge to make this outcome not just possible, but probable. Miss any one of them and the correction fails. The first front is hormonal. After 60, the anabolic hormonal environment, the chemical signaling system that triggers muscle repair and growth, has been degrading for decades and is now operating at a fraction of its former capacity. Testosterone in men drops roughly 1 to 2% per year from middle age onward. Estrogen in women falls sharply at menopause, removing a key regulator of muscle protein metabolism. Growth hormone secretion decreases by approximately 14% per decade after 30. And IGF-1, the primary driver of muscle protein synthesis, the process by which the body actually builds and repairs muscle fibers, follows the same downward curve. Testosterone falls, estrogen falls, growth hormone follows, IGF-1 follows. The entire anabolic architecture declines in parallel. Not because something went wrong, because this is the predictable, measurable biology of the decade after 60. The hormonal signals that once responded to physical effort by rebuilding muscle are still present. They are simply too weak to complete the job. The second front is what happens to protein, specifically to the body's ability to use it. First, understand the mechanism. Muscle protein synthesis, the process of building and repairing muscle fibers, is not triggered by total protein consumed. It is triggered by leucine, the specific amino acid that acts as the direct molecular signal for synthesis activation. Second, understand the threshold. When leucine concentration in the blood crosses a certain level after a meal, the synthesis signal fires. Below that level, it does not fire, regardless of how much total protein was eaten. Third, understand what age does to that threshold. A phenomenon called anabolic resistance means that older muscle requires significantly more leucine to produce the same anabolic response that a smaller amount would have generated at 40. The clinical recommendation rises accordingly. 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, distributed across meals, emphasizing leucine-rich sources, eggs, fish, dairy, legumes, at each one. Eating what feels like adequate protein is not adequate. That is not a motivation failure. That is biochemistry operating against an assumption that was never updated. The third front is where conventional medical advice stops being neutral and becomes an active problem. Standard weight loss strategy in this age group combines caloric restriction with aerobic activity. Walk more, eat less. From a cardiovascular standpoint, the aerobic component delivers genuine benefit. From a muscle preservation standpoint, caloric restriction without concurrent resistance training sends the body a specific physiological message. Resources are scarce, and the most metabolically expensive tissue, muscle, should be reduced. In a caloric deficit without a resistance training stimulus, the body has no reason to protect that tissue. It is expensive to maintain. The body eliminates it. The clinical data on this is not ambiguous. In older adults, losing weight through caloric restriction and aerobic activity alone, approximately 30 to 40% of the total weight lost comes not from fat, but from lean muscle tissue. First, the scale moves down. Second, the clothes fit differently. Third, the body that produced those results has a slower resting metabolism, worse insulin resistance, weaker bones, and a higher fall risk than the body that began the process. Not weight loss, muscle loss wearing the costume of weight loss. Here is how you know this is happening, before any blood work, before any imaging, before any appointment. The signals are functional, they are observable, and they are specific enough that clinical practice uses them as screening thresholds, not because they are rough approximations, but because the data confirms they predict exactly what is occurring inside the muscle compartment. The first signal is grip strength. Not a fitness metric, not a gym measurement. Grip strength is a validated clinical predictor of all-cause mortality, of muscle mass loss, and of functional decline trajectory. First, understand what it measures. The integrated output of the neuromuscular system, reflecting systemic muscle status, not just hand strength. Second, understand what to track. Not a single absolute number, but direction. Whether grip strength today is meaningfully lower than it was 1 year ago. A decline that shows up in tasks that once felt effortless, opening jars, carrying bags, holding a railing through a turn, is a clinical signal. Third, understand what it means. The hand reflects the whole. Grip declining means muscle is declining systemically, not locally. The second signal is calf circumference. This one is precise. Below 34 centimeters in women and below 33 centimeters in men is a sarcopenia screening threshold used in clinical practice. The calf is not an arbitrary measurement site. Calf muscle is among the most resistant compartments to age-related atrophy. It is loaded constantly during ordinary daily movement, which provides a low-level preservation stimulus that other muscle groups do not receive. When calf circumference falls below threshold, the loss has progressed past the more vulnerable compartments and is now reducing even the most mechanically stimulated tissue in the lower body. Measure it with a tape at the widest point. That number carries clinical meaning that no scale reading can replicate. The third signal requires no equipment. Stand in front of a standard chair with your arms crossed over your chest. Sit. Stand. If that movement requires uncrossing the arms, pushing off the armrests, rocking forward for momentum, or produces a visible struggle at any point, the hip extensors, quadriceps, and core stabilizers that should power it unassisted are no longer generating sufficient force. Not because of joint pain, not because of poor balance alone, because the contractile tissue driving the movement has been reduced below the threshold needed for the task. Clinical assessment uses exactly this test. It is sensitive enough to detect meaningful change year over year. The fourth signal is fatigue calibrated against a personal baseline. Not compared to a 40-year-old, not compared to a population average, compared to what the same activities required 12 months ago. A walk that felt manageable last spring that now produces exhaustion at half the distance. A grocery run that now requires sitting on return. The relevant question is not how much capacity remains. It is how fast capacity is declining relative to recent personal history. Slow, stable limitation is one clinical picture. Rapid recent decline is another. After 60, rapid recent functional decline in the absence of acute illness means muscle is going faster than it should. Not because of age alone, because of a process that is identifiable and correctable. When these four signals appear together, declining grip, reduced calf circumference, failed chair stand, accelerating functional fatigue, The picture is not ambiguous. The body is losing muscle faster than it is losing fat. Whatever weight loss is occurring is coming from the wrong compartment. And here is the response that typically follows. The person reports the fatigue and weakness at their next appointment. The physician sees a patient who remains above ideal weight. The physician recommends continued caloric restriction. The patient restricts further, adds another walking session. The scale continues to move. First, muscle continues to leave with it. Second, metabolism slows further as the metabolically active tissue-driving resting caloric expenditure decreases. Third, insulin resistance worsens because muscle is the primary site of glucose uptake, and there is now less of it. At the next appointment, the weight is lower. The physician notes improvement. The patient is weaker, more insulin resistant, and statistically closer to a fall that will not resolve with getting up and brushing off. The advice was not wrong for the number. It was catastrophic for the body producing it. This is where the standard weight loss approach after 60 becomes an active accelerant rather than a neutral tool. Aerobic activity without resistance training provides no mechanical signal to preserve muscle tissue under caloric restriction. The body receives two simultaneous inputs. Resources are scarce, and no specific demand is being placed on muscle. The physiological response is not a malfunction. It is the system operating exactly as designed, reducing the most expensive tissue when resources are limited and no signal justifies its preservation. Visceral fat, more metabolically conservative, releases more slowly under moderate restriction. The body composition shift moves in the wrong direction even as the scale confirms progress. Lighter, slower metabolism, greater insulin resistance, weaker bones, higher fall risk. Successful by every metric the scale measures. A clinical failure by every metric that matters after 60. The correction does not involve doing less. It involves doing three specific things simultaneously, and the word simultaneously is not rhetorical. Performing one or two of the three while omitting the third continues the damage in a slower form. All three levers must engage at the same time. The first lever is resistance training, not an additional walking session, not a fourth aerobic class. Resistance training, progressive loading of large muscle groups 2 to 3 times per week. Large muscle groups first, the quadriceps, the hamstrings, the glutes, the back extensors, the pressing muscles of the chest and shoulders. First, understand why large groups. They govern functional movement, stabilize the skeleton under load, and account for the majority of resting metabolic expenditure. Second, understand why progressive. A body never asked to do more than it did last week has no stimulus to adapt upward, and adaptation is the entire point. Third, understand what progressive loading reaches that aerobic work does not. Fast twitch muscle fibers, the fibers responsible for catching a stumble, for the reactive force that prevents a fall, are recruited only under load. Walking does not reach them. Resistance training does. 2 to 3 sessions per week targeting large muscle groups is the evidence-based minimum effective dose for this population. That is not an athletic commitment. That is the biological minimum required to send the preservation signal the body needs to stop treating muscle as expendable. The second lever is protein restructuring, and restructuring means something more specific than simply increasing total daily grams. First, understand the mechanism. Muscle protein synthesis is not a daily average. It is a meal-by-meal event triggered when leucine concentration in the bloodstream crosses a threshold after eating. Second, understand the error. An older adult who eats lightly at breakfast, skips meaningful protein at lunch, and concentrates the majority of their intake at dinner has nominally hit a reasonable daily total and has fired the synthesis signal weekly in the morning, missed it at midday, and fired it once at night. 3 opportunities, 1 partial use. Third, understand the correction. 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, distributed across every meal with leucine-rich sources, eggs, fish, dairy, legumes, present at breakfast and lunch, not banked at the evening meal. Each meal is an opportunity to fire the synthesis signal or miss it. After 60, with anabolic resistance reducing the sensitivity of that signal, missing it consistently is not a neutral scheduling decision. It is the difference between maintaining the muscle compartment and losing it slowly enough not to notice until the chair stand fails. The third lever is caloric calibration, and this is where the most common overcorrection follows understanding the first 2. After recognizing that aggressive restriction destroys muscle, some people eliminate the deficit entirely. That is not the correction. Fat reduction still requires a caloric deficit. The question is the depth. In this population, the evidence supports a maximum daily deficit of 300 to 400 calories, not 700, not 1,000. Not the aggressive restriction that urgency and impatience recommend. The ceiling is hard for a specific reason. Below a certain caloric threshold, the body interprets scarcity as a survival condition and activates anabolic shutdown, a state in which muscle protein synthesis is suppressed regardless of protein intake and regardless of resistance training stimulus, because conservation overrides construction. A 300 to 400 calorie deficit produces measurable fat loss across weeks and months. It is modest enough to keep the body outside conservation mode. It preserves the anabolic environment that the resistance training and protein restructuring are working to sustain. Deeper cuts do not accelerate the result. They erase it. Here is exactly what to do. 1. Begin resistance training 2 to 3 times per week, prioritizing large muscle groups. If no program exists, start with bodyweight squats, hip hinges, and a pressing movement. Add load as each movement becomes manageable. The load does not need to be heavy to start. It needs to be present and progressive. 2. Calculate your protein target, 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, and distribute it across every meal. Include a leucine-rich source at breakfast and at lunch, not only at dinner. 3. If you are currently restricting calories, determine the depth of that deficit. If you are more than 400 calories below your maintenance level, you are working against the other 2 levers. Reduce the deficit, not the ambition. 4. Measure your calf circumference today and record it. Measure it again in 8 weeks. That single number, tracked over time, will tell you whether the muscle compartment is responding before any other metric reflects the change. 5. Place the scale in its correct position, one data point among several, not the measure by which the entire intervention is judged. How are you currently eating and training? Write it in the comments. The pattern will tell me exactly where the correction needs to happen. Nobody in a clinic is going to walk you through this at a routine appointment. The system is not structured for it. It is structured around treatment, and it profits from treatment, not from the prevention that makes treatment unnecessary. Identifying this process early, restructuring protein distribution, initiating resistance training before the muscle loss becomes severe enough to show up as a fall, none of that generates a billing code. That is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe to Dr. Waterling and leave a like on this video. What you just heard is what that last appointment skipped.